My name is Ralph Dring. I now live in Bloomington, but we used to live on Irving Avenue in Blue Island. And my sister is Nancy Dring, and she now lives in Houston, Texas.
But I still love trains.
But our family always has loved trains. My brother actually now has his own train, a little model steam engine. He's in some sort of a club where he can operate his little steam train in this club. That's really going pretty far for love of trains.
We grew up in Blue Island because our grandfather, Bill Dring, was an engineer on the Rock Island Railroad train. And we were just little children, but we would see him go through and we could wave at Grandpa as he went through. And it was a big thing because the steam train was so big and so scary, but it was our grandpa, so it was okay. And Blue Island had the roundhouse where the big cross-country steam engines had to be changed to another smaller locomotive that could take them into the city where they couldn't go. The big locomotives couldn't go. So a major shop, the roundhouse where they traded the engines, repairs, all were done here in Blue Island.
Bill Dring was a locomotive engineer on a steam engine, and steam engines were different than diesel engines because the engineer had to know about safety. He always had to have water in the boiler. He always had to be sure that nothing would break. So a locomotive engineer at that time was the equivalent of perhaps an airline pilot of our time. It was a very prestigious job. Alice Dring, that's our grandmother, she loved him very much, and she only had one son. That son was our father, George. George did not become a locomotive engineer, but our grandmother, Alice, that's her in the picture, gave Lionel electric train sets to my brother Ross and to myself as gifts, and we grew up loving the railroad. When my brother was old enough, he got a job as a yard clerk on the Rock Island Railroad. We lived on Irving Avenue, and it wasn't a great distance to walk. So he actually worked on the railroad that my grandfather worked on. And later, both my dad, George, that was his son, and my brother, who was his grandson, worked at an amusement park running steam engines at an amusement park. Actual steam engines. They're like, I think, quarter size, a smaller size, but actual steam engines with the real parts. I did not drive a locomotive engineer, but I have loved locomotive engineer. I've loved trains all my life. And at the Museum of Science and Industry, there's one hall that has a model railroad. And his brother was an engineer controlled that model railroad in the Museum of Science and Industry, in the hall of the Museum of Science and Industry. He had to take a test to prove that he knew the rules of the road for the Santa Fe Railroad when he was operating that train. So when we were children, we got to go to the museum and see our great uncle operating that train. And I remember that we wanted to have a little race between a freight train and a passenger train, and we were certain that the freight train would bypass the passenger train, but there were rules that made one train stop and another train could go through, and the opposite of what we expected in the train occurred in the race at the Museum of Science and Industry. The Blue Island is historical because Chicago is a railroad town. All the railroads in the United States converge on Chicago. It's the most important city for railroads. And there was a time when there was the great railroad strike. There was the Pullman strike. And in the Blue Island brickyards, what later became the Blue Island brickyards, there actually were strikers that were attacking the police. So Blue Island was historical in labor history as well. I don't know about my grandfather having any involvement in that because that was before his time. But he felt a very strong sense of duty operating the train. There would be times if you couldn't get another engineer, you would have to work an extra shift. It was a duty. It was something that you were required as a duty. And in my father, who was not a locomotive engineer for pay, he later worked for Commonwealth Edison. And he had that same sense of duty that you had to have electricity for the city of Chicago, no matter what. If you had to work extra hours, do whatever you had to do to make sure that electricity would be available to the people. So that sense of duty carried over from my father to from my grandfather to my father, and the love of railroads went to my father and to my brother and also to myself, although I never got to operate a steam locomotive myself. The nearest I ever came to it was there were little kits where you could get a steam engine and you would operate a little like a model kit operate a steam engine. I got to do that. I never got to drive a steam engine myself. But I've always loved railroads, and railroads were the glue that held the country together. That was the way that all the commerce was able to travel around the country.